I'm Chris Blas. Welcome to another episode of the Inevitability Curve. With us today is a good friend, Dennis Develin. Dennis, how are you today?
Good morning, Chris. Very well and delighted to be here.
And where is here for you? Where are you in the world today?
I'm living in Palm Beach County, Florida, not far from Mar-a-Lago, but our paths don't cross very often.
That's right. Well, you actually have been on the boats. You know, you're one of the few people who have multiple times.
Twice.
So,
Twice.
That's right.
Yeah.
As I've sailed up and down in different versions of these things. So that, as we're discussing in the green room, right, the topic today, the title of this episode, quite often I don't know until we're done with it, but this one, you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to expand on that. So seeking the recursive bill of materials of truth, and I think I'm going to go there, right? As we look back, I think we need to look all of human history, the last 500,000 years, right? And most of that time, I think, again, I'm not the expert, people can look things up, but these sort of time frames, I think, 4,500,000 years of that was communities. We're living together. I mean, everybody. The
Sure.
bill of materials of truth is your life experience, because everyone you're going to meet, you've met already. You live with them forever. Everybody knows. So it was a very short supply chain of truth then. But we get into the 40, 50,000 years ago, it seems to be, humans started getting into these civilization things, larger groups where you just not necessarily know everything. And the things we were producing, you're not necessarily getting everything from the person who produced it. So I think that transitional period, right? Think how profound that was. For hundreds of thousands of years, no one ever met anybody they didn't know, to suddenly having to work out how you trust people you're meeting during your lifetime. Mm-hmm. And I think that's similar, as we're discussing in the green room, right? The transition going on right now is that same sort of fundamental. We're just working things out. Absolutely. Or am I exaggerating?
No, you're not exaggerating at all. If you think about it, human interaction was face-to-face. And it wasn't until we could abstract commerce with some sort of currency, you were actually trading one thing for another. Okay, so face to face. Think of the dilemma we've always had with identity management in information technology. You can only prove your identity by one of three things: something you have, something you know, or something you are. For most of the millennia, it was something you are, right? You would see the person, you say, yep, that's who they are. Credentials, known credentials or carried credentials, are a very recent artifact. So people were accustomed to face-to-face truth. Remember, I go back on the internet a long time. I was very fortunate in my career. I started in industry in 1972. I was actually one of the first computer security people, I think, in 1974, because we put in a system for communication across the complex with coaxial cables. The systems didn't leave buildings that we owned, and yet we had identity management. We had accountability. We had the law of least privileges. We had, credentials that were only known by the individual, so that there was accountability. And I had the good fortune of meeting my first mentor in security was a guy named Robert Courtney from IBM. He's the person who allegedly coined confidentiality, integrity, and availability, testifying before Congress very early on. And this was again, in 1974, and he came in to work with us for the day. And I was fascinated listening to him. And he said something that I knew was important at the time, and I wrote it down and memorized it. And he said the definition of what he called computer security was the prevention of accidental or intentional disclosure, modification, or destruction of digital information. Now, that's kind of stood the test of time. But to the point you were making about authenticity, how do you define that something is confidential? How do you define who has the authority to change that information? And how do you define who has the authority to destroy that information without having some sort of attestation of ownership, attestation of fact, attestation of truth. And as okay, so fast forward 1985, I was at Harvard University, and I left industry and went to higher ed, and I had the good fortune of having a very early static IP address. Think of it. In those days, I went back and I used ChatGPT to look. There were 2,000 hosts on the entire ARPANET in 1985, and there were 50,000 accounts, and I had the good fortune of having one of them. It wasn't on a PC or a Mac because they didn't support TCP/IP. It had to go through a host, or if you had a Unix workstation, you could run TCP/IP. But again, if you think about it, kind of everybody knew everybody else. The vetting process was affiliation with an institution of higher education or a research center or whatever. So go from 2,000 or 50,000 users in 1985 to whatever the godforsaken number is today.
All of us.
Right, all of it. Literally the world population. And I think it was in the Atlantic. There's a famous cartoon of a dog sitting at a workstation, and the balloon says, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog," and that's
right.
the definition of the problem of authenticity and attestation and vetting. Now, so the identity of the people involved is one aspect. The next aspect is the information that they're talking about or disclosing, discussing. And if you think about it, there needs to be a very high barrier of entry to become a publisher, right? I mean, to be a book publisher or a newspaper publisher or whatever, you had to have all sorts of infrastructure. And this was for printed media. This is pre-digital. So there were reporters, there were editors, there was a tremendous vetting process that took place. So by the time you read a reporter in the New York Times, or by the time you watched Walter Cronkite on television, a lot of vetting had taken place. So there was an imprimatur, or imprimatur, however you say that word. There was an attestation that this was a fact that you could believe, right? So I read an article. Go ahead, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for rambling.
I was going to say, I got a key on the time part of it, right? I have such good conversations in the green room before these episodes, right? I wish I could capture that because we had, but I'm going to try to tease it back out here because time, right? You were talking about the consumer opacity. That you and I grew up with, everybody, tend to grow up with, where you go to the store, you buy a thing, you can't see anything particularly about where it came from, what it cost. Cars used to have the price. We go to the car dealership and say price, and they give us price. We go, okay, so now we know, before we go, what it costs to build, what the components are, what the options are, what the cost of the dealer costs. We have all this transparency as consumers. And that resonates so much with my common threads, because again, supply chain security has been my main track for the last 5-6 years, right? And I love it because just like we're saying, who's on the internet now? All of us. Who's in the supply chain? What's the supply chain? Everyone and everything, right? Because if we're going to come up with a supply chain security system that works, we can't say for this set of companies,
right,
or this set of countries, because that's not how supply chains work. Everything's connected. Everything is connected. If I can see only so far down, my transparency goes so far down. At some point, I can't keep the lights on. And the point I'm not making, trying to get to, is the time, right? And I see this again. This is what I think when I talk about inevitability curves, right? I see things following a certain direction. If they continue, you're just creating more and more barriers, more and more pressure to make some sort of change.
Right.
Because to continue going that direction, X, Y, Z maxes out halfway there. So obviously, if we're going to get to that point, we'll come up with something other than X, Y, Z, right? And today, we'll take the social media side. The public information is just saying publishing. The time to publish and the resource necessary to publish has gone from significant to near zero.
Correct.
In the last 30 years. And there has not been a commensurate rise in anything like any sort of attestation system that, going all the way back to my initial conversations, that we started to develop 40, 50,000 years ago. How do I actually trust someone I'm not actually dealing with directly all the time? We've gotten pretty good at that in a human scale slowly. We've gotten pretty good at that in the industrial age, supply chain. We haven't figured out how to do that in the nanosecond. Everyone's, a global publisher. Disinformation, misinformation, influence campaigns have no barriers to entry. Right.
I mean, if you think about it, the first problem was, like I said, identity management, right? It was the dilemma was always sharing the secret, right? Because unless you have the secret at both ends, you can't encrypt. And I had the good fortune of meeting with Diffie one time. We were stuck. We were at a meeting, and our flights were canceled, and we're sitting there drinking wine at the bar, and he told me the story of when he came up with the notion of the public key, private key, splitting the key pair. And that was a breakthrough, because before that happened, you may not know exactly who it is, but at least it's a known entity at the other end, right? And we don't have anything like that with information. Tim Berners-Lee, I mentioned, I read an article he wrote recently where he said he was frustrated that the web did not become what he thought it was going to become. Right? He thought it was going to be individual publishers, and now we've gotten lazy. We've gotten concentrated with social media sites and so forth, and people use that for publishing, but it's publishing in an echo chamber. So there isn't, while there's this facade of authenticity, it really isn't, and we still have not. Are the police ready to board you?
No, just no. Checking somebody else. No, we still haven't. Not this time, right?
Those people, you people.
You people. Right? Yeah.
But he wanted individuals to be publishers. But to your point, when individuals are publishers, I'm taking a history course, right? And I'm sorry for rambling, but this my brain works. My brain works like your brain. I'm taking a history course right
now. Sorry for that.
I just turned 75, and I wanted to try to get a sense of why we're where we are, right? So this history course starts in 1750, right? And it talks about what's the professor is great. There's a guy named Mark Rose, and he talks about what life was like in 1750, and it was kind of okay, right? They could communicate and so forth, and then the British started getting onerous, and they imposed the Stamp Act. And we think of the Stamp Act like the Boston Tea Party, but it also affected freedom of the press. It also affected the Federalists being able to communicate ideas to other people. And those were some of the things from 1750 to 1776. People got really upset because they couldn't communicate the way they wanted to. And that was part of the justification of the revolution. Right now, I realize this is off subject from the bill of materials of authenticity.
I don't think it is. Yeah, truth. Yeah. Well, yeah, because you said something right there. People were getting really cranky with, right, and that is one of the, I think, particularly in an engineering sort of technocrat world that I live in. Is one of the things I struggle with explaining most to my peers, because sociology is a thing. Right. And I think a lot, when I look at the sides of a potential path I see ahead, some inevitability curve thing, as you get to the sides of it, people just get crankier. That's really what it is. As you reach the edge of that, there's just, to overcome that amount of crankiness, something big has to happen. Otherwise, we'll go back to the middle. And right now, I think I believe this strongly across any political ideological spectrum. Everyone is exhausted trying to figure out what's true. Everyone, I have very good friends, lifelong friends that we completely disagree politically, and they're saying, like, a friend is a truck driver, right? He's saying, even today at the truck stops, the truck drivers aren't even talking to each other because they believe so many different things that it used to be easy. You believe this or that, and if I believe that, hey, we're all getting along. But now it's like, I believe that. Oh, I believe that too, and this. Well, not that part, right?
One of the
So we're in this
framers of the
fractal distruth world, right,
one
where
of the framers
everybody is dissatisfied.
one of the framers of the Constitution was Monroe, and Monroe, in a thing called Federalist 10, one of the Federalist Papers, talked about how there will always be factions and, like splinter groups in the country. But what they did was, with the Louisiana Purchase and some of those things, expanding the country kind of diluted that. So, so factions were separated in space, and they were separated in time because communication took a long time, right? So some thinking had to take place before you could react to something. Now everything happens in near real time with information that you have no idea what the origin of it is. Right now, again, think of what we did with identity management. We put public key infrastructure in place so that there was a central repository of truth about identities, right? That could be used to sign and seal messages going back and forth. So you had non-repudiation and you had secrecy, right? Now think of information itself. I've heard of people talking about using NFTs for. The problem with digital information. Nick Negroponte wrote a book called Being Digital back in the years when I was at Harvard, and he said when atoms become bits, everything changes. Every copy is an original, right? So we came up with NFTs, and we were gonna authenticate the original digital representation of something. That's kind of like being the tallest dwarf. It's an oxymoron, right? Every copy is an original. So the notion of authenticity, what you and I talked about with the bill of materials, I was thinking of was a guy I met when I was at Harvard, Dick Nolan, and I think he worked with Boeing on the bill of materials, and they wanted to say, I want to build one airplane, and it says, okay, then I need this many fuselages and this many wings, and each wing is made up of this many things, and you could ultimately figure out how many screws you needed to put the whole thing together. Right? Information is kind of the same thing, right? And that was when I first heard about blockchain, I thought this will be interesting, but who is the ultimate authority to deem something true?
Well, let me see if I can use that as a segue. So we talked a lot about the past, and we're talking a lot about the present, right? And I think the other half of the present may tell us something about the future, and it's PKI, Whit Diffie, right? Whit's done great work, and that's been a wonderful thing, and the PKI structure worked, right? But it's always been one of my favorite whipping boys because it's do we really, we're going to build a global internet, thing, and we're going to arbitrarily, create a couple certificate authorities, and everybody's going to believe those. Why exactly those and not, anyways. So I saw that as a step along the way.
Right.
And my work in supply chain, one of my litmus strips I keep sticking in the soil, is how often people say, where is the singular repository going to be? Because if you're thinking that, you're missing the whole point, right? And I think this leads to our topic of truth, because in supply chains, look, software supply chains, lots of different people can attest to what's inside their software. That's what a SBOM, what a software bill of material is all about. Could be the people who made the software, could be somebody who analyzed the software, could be, your old Uncle Ted, who knows, right? And lots of people could, gather those up or put a directory together to say, here are the good ones. And they could be a government, it could be our government, somebody else's government, a state government, local government, a flower knitting club, who knows?
But isn't that what blockchain is supposed to be? A distributed repository of authenticity?
Well, so DBOM, the Digital Bill of Materials, dbom.io, plug, Linux Foundation project that Mehdi Intezari and I dreamt up at Unisys in 2019 is really my one experience with that, right? All you blockchain experts can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's, so blockchain is just a repository method, distributed ledgers. I have two or more magic ledgers that if anybody writes or delete, erases anything, they all change at the same time. Mm-hmm. And to my point, there is not a blockchain. There's not some authoritative ledger out there. It's just a way of creating authoritative ledgers that are authoritative to a given level of authoritative, depending on who you are setting it up, right?
Okay.
And in supply chain, I see really good uses for that, where you have a high you want a high non-repudiation. I want to know that if I'm going to grab an artifact out of this particular repository, I have a very, very high level of comfort that it really is something that I can plug into my operations this second. And there are others where the other parts of supply chains where you don't need all that rigor. Where a Mongo database, having the same sort of attestations is perfectly fine, right? And that there is no authoritative source, not universally authoritative source. It's all relative. So I guess that my posit I'll put out there for debate for the moment is all along the internet really should have been fully distributed, right? And throw in one more war story. I just learned this, right? Because I and Amaya El-Gindi and Andrew Flint invented network address translation in 1991 or two, totally out of the blue. Never read anything about it. Just 15 minutes at a whiteboard. I'd always thought that John Mays, who invented the PICs, and one other group who wrote the original RFC, also independently came up with it. But I just found out that there actually was, I wasn't part of that conversation at the time, but there was resistance to network address translation because the internet was supposed to be peer-to-peers with no walls. Every host can see every host, basically, right? And of course, we live in a highly natted world these days, and we're all used to that, and there's no other sort of way to get there. But I guess my point is that fundamentally, the internet shouldn't have a single authoritative source for XYZ, whatever it is. It should enable people to create authoritative sources that then Darwinianly, succeed or not. They're effective at providing the service, being truthful in this case, being reliable or not. And I think that's the positive path forward as we embrace more of the. It's not the U.S. federal government going to set up the truth repository. It's us techies who are going to come up with mechanisms where people can set up, systems for attesting the truth to each other.
Wasn't that kind of what PGP was, and like circles of trust, that sort of thing?
Right. Yeah, we've been edging there, right?
Yeah,
Have you read Ender's Game? The novel Ender's Game.
No.
A classic sci-fi. But it's very popular, but it's a couple hundred years in the future, aliens and so forth. But the key point is there's a couple of kids, right? And two of the kids, they're all genius. Three of them are geniuses, and the two that one goes off. Ender he's the hero, and the other two stay at home on Earth, and they assume personas on the internet. This sort of pre-internet novel, and at that time, you had to earn the right to get inside the circles of trust. So you can literally sit there and debate with the world leaders if you could, on the world stage, if you could, get there. And it's only a page or two of description, but I always thought that's how it works out, right? You have to, not just everybody gets to talk in every room. That's just chaos. Not just the elites who were there in the first place, but somehow, through earning the right by arguing well, we can, all argue together.
I'll send you the recent article I read by Tim Berners-Lee because it was exactly that. His vision was that it was going to be a really, distributed peer kind of a web, and instead we've had these concentrations that become echo chambers that are reinforced by negativity because that's what keeps you online. And his whole premise was, how do we break that?
Well, let's take that as the segue for the future, right? Because I really, as the host, I shouldn't lead the question so much, but too bad, my show. Because I feel very strongly about this. I think we're in a species wide ponderment that goes back, let's just say, the French Revolution, and trying to work out whether humans are intrinsically scumbags that need to be beaten by authoritative figures, or if we're on average intrinsically intelligent, enlightened self-interest and so forth. Because if we're the first, then forget democracy and freedom of speech. It's just not practical. We literally have to be ruled forever, thousands of years forever. If the second is true, then yes, all these Boy Scout dreams of democracy and freedom of speech and open systems work. So I think that while the present is a mess, I think at some point in the future, maybe decades out, not centuries, Darwin selects for transparency. But right now, so what we see right now can't survive over the long term.
I've always believed governments get in the way. I can remember an experience. One of the places I lived, I was trying to learn Windows NT, and I ran into this guy in the laundry room. I was living in a condo. I ran into this guy in the laundry room. We got talking. He was really good in Windows NT. So we had dinner together one night. It turns out he was from Russia. He had grown up in the Soviet Union. And we started comparing notes of what we had learned in terms of propaganda as kids. And had it not been for the government, he would have been one of my best friends. Two governments, you know. And so the organizations of government get in the way. Institutions get in the way. I mean, I think I agree with your point that in a real egalitarian peer federated society or for peer federated network, we would have a much better chance of doing something that follows the virtuous cycle rather than the vicious cycle, and we're kind of reinforcing.
Hey, those are two interesting V words, right? Virtuous and vicious. Not really opposites, but it's not so much virtuous. It's lower. It is more productive. It's less friction, less strain. Vicious is a good word for it. It's unproductive. It stresses. Things get broken. It's unproductive. I've worked on security for many years, and I still find it interesting when I'm talking to my peers. When someone gets, well, it's not about money. This is about security. It's about the right and wrong and virtue and so forth. I'm like, yeah. So how do we pay for that? Because when you find a way, as a professional, as a person with a job and a career and interest in helping businesses and so forth, I see opportunities and money flows. This great thing. But what I also see is evolutionists. Because when I find that I can get security in, is usually by saying, look, you don't need to do this, but your competitor is going to, and they're going to lower their costs. And they're going to have better customer retention. They have better trust with their customers. They're going to spend less time selling and more time fulfilling orders. So they'll be more profitable. And in 3 to 5 years, they will put you out of business and, maybe take over your company, buy you, and fire you because you're the one who decided not to do this. That's Stuart Phillips right there.
Back in, I think it was 2001, I gave the first presentation ever to the board of directors of what is now Thomson Reuters. In that case, it was just Thomson. And everybody was nervous. I'm sitting between the CIO and the CFO, and I was like the sacrificial lamb. I was the CISO. I was the sacrificial lamb to present to them. And I'm thinking, what could I possibly say to these people that would resonate? I'm not going to talk about the technologies that we use or anything else. So somebody told me that at the executive level, they think in threes. So I started thinking about risk. And I said, there are really 3 risks that we're trying to manage. Okay. Risks to revenue, risks to reputation, and risks to regulatory compliance. Right? The revenue part is your point. With customers, if a customer thinks somebody else is a more secure, more trustworthy provider of products and services, they're going to go there, right? And if there's a breach, they're not going to want to use our stuff. Reputation affects investment, and all you guys are compensated with stock options and everything else. Reputation hits the stock price, okay? And regulatory compliance has its own ROI, and it's not return on investment, it's risk of incarceration. Because you as fiduciary officers of the institution, this was when Sarbanes-Oxley came out, and I turned to the CFO and I said, if our financial statements are corrupt, I'll tie yellow ribbons around all our trees until you get out of prison, because you're the guy that signed it, not me. Like, we're partners. If we make those more secure, that helps me and that helps you. We have a common good, but you're the one that's taking a risk on this. And all of a sudden, it looked different to them. I mean, senior executives deal with risk all the time, right? And they said, but you come in with these mumbo jumbo metrics. So I said, okay, well, we'll try to come up with metrics that have a line of sight to the strategic mission of the business. And that was a tipping point of our program. The program became very successful after that.
Well, and that's, that wasn't just Thomson Reuters, right? That at that time, and the CISO, the sacrificial lamb. I always think of the fusible link, right?
Yeah.
That little piece of metal that melts. It's like a sacrificial cup.
Yeah.
But that was the era when CISOs were that fusible link, right? And folks like you were out there making those arguments and winning them. Now I think that's boards tend to get this a lot better these days. Took a long time.
Yeah.
And I think in this, for the prognostication of the future part, I think this is, huge endemic common problems are also huge, opportunities.
Sure.
When most people are sick and tired of its waste and it's taking up time and it's expensive, then whoever invents that mousetrap, is going to take over the world.
Right.
And I think that's what we're lining ourselves up for. I think it's not just, this decade, these last couple of administrations or whatnot. I think the time span that I and even more so you have worked through this information system sort of shows how we got here. And I think shows that there's this big log jam and everybody's cranky and the next thing has to come around to replace it, where it's not, we don't live in a world where nobody knows what's true.
Now I'm going to try to play Chris Blas and get us back on the other topic.
Please.
The whole when we talked about the bill of materials of truth and we talked about recursion, it's because facts and truth are not totally atomic. They're usually based on something else. And we were making the analogy with supply chain that I remember in the pharmaceutical industry, we had batch lot control. And if we found one ingredient that was bad, I developed one of their systems that you could do batch lot control and trace that to all the batches of product that went out that you could do a recall. It's very early, a supply chain sort of thing. Well, truth is the same way. Like what you're citing as, I mean, that's why term papers have a footnotes and and how do we do that? In
the time available.
In the time available, where does that repository live? Where are those relationships established in a trustworthy way? That's the circle of trust. Who was it? Phil Zimmerman, was he PGP?
Yeah.
I mean, that was breakthrough thinking at the time. That kind of a structure can work, but it's not going to work fast enough.
Right. And because it's all got to be about speed, right? The every conversation, whether it's literally in the supply chain space or any other these days, I find myself saying all that information was available at the beginning, all of it. And if you needed it, if there was a flight crash investigation, NTSB thing, we would find over the next 6 to 18 months all of the information. So it's all there. It's all just a matter of time.
I mean, what about good AI? A lot of us use ChatGPT for researching things. Could we come up with an authoritative AI engine that would help with some of that?
Well, again, I would worry less about authoritative. Worry about more effective. Now, if somebody finds it and says, "Okay, I will use that authoritative for me," right? And this is the recursive bomb to me, right? Because people will start saying, "Well, who's going to declare what's true?" It's like, I don't care. Nobody. That's not how the saying works.
I would just like authoritative.
Right. I would like to be able to people to see what I say and what I write, what I post, and so forth, and have a pretty damn good idea that really was me. Now, whether it was true or not, but I did it. It was me. Right. That's and I think one of the problems we have is as technology and policy and academic geeky folks, we're trying to find the perfect solution when we realize, and this is where the thread across human history comes from, right? So I think in early civilizations, take that, say it was 40, 50,000 years ago, we somehow over a couple generations, couple centuries, figured out how we can trust that third party. And it worked. Obviously, civilization continued to grow, and it wasn't perfect, and it still hasn't been. And but so I think rather than the authoritative repository,
but it wasn't an abstracted third party. Distance makes a difference. Okay, I mean, I can trust somebody that I can see and touch and interact with. The anonymity, the abstraction, I think something else has to compensate for that.
Well, the Silk Road, Mesopotamia, I love these little clay tablets. The clay tablet inside the clay tablet, right?
Yeah.
That was actually a fascinating, and I'd love to be able to fly in the wall. Who thought of that one? It's like you say, we're like with Whit Diffie or something. You're just sitting there with coffee or whatever the equivalent time. You wait, we'll wrap it. Oh, when you break it when you get there. And so we've done well enough. And there's always been people who can find a way around that, but not enough to stop us from doing it. And we're at that point again, right, where we can't continue, I don't think, much further forward in reducing our ability, to know things. We're approaching some critical minimum, and it costs a lot. It takes us all time, energy. Our productivity is lower. It's reducing costs everywhere. So I think we will find a way.
Here's an interesting thought. Do you think that, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think this is important. If you look at the way our democracy is being practiced right now, right? When people talk about MAGA, and they talk about the 50s. I grew up in the 50s. I was born in 1950, right? I remember it vividly, and there was some good stuff. But there was also polio. I knew a kid in an iron lung. I mean, there were a lot of things that weren't as peachy as people would make it. But oh my God, what was I just going to say? Because it was profound. I'm drawing a blank. I forgot what I was going to say. Go ahead. Help me.
Yeah. I'm just searching there myself. So the talking about the recursive bomb, right? How we get third party abstracted trust. I was gonna. I just did say this. We actually did. We put together reasonable methods for this in the past, right? And again, I think, as I talk about supply chain, over the last 6-7 years now. One of the things I find keeps saying is all of these contracts, all these relationships are already written down, right? It already exists. There's a PDF somewhere that both parties signed that has the rules, the regulations are written down, the laws are written down, everything, every single step in the supply chain is already represented in text, in available text that anybody could compile, from end to end for the supply chain of anything. It would just take you a long time, right? And I think, you look at all the spots in the actual literal supply chain, logistics people, big power companies and so forth. There's lots of processes, and those processes used to be paper. They used to use fax machines. And they've been, advancing along all this time. So again, it's not just about security. These systems have been automating. Those contracts that are in a filing cabinet that someone has to call someone in legal to pull and photocopy it are now online. Right. Inside the company, you might be able to pull it up online on your intranet, if that's still a word. I think they end up being electronically available to automated systems with appropriate authority in real time all the time, so that I can read every contract, or I can have read for me, right? Talk about authority. My AI says, all right, I have the authority to act for Chris Blas, and I have acting under this contract that you, second party, have already agreed to. And in that contract, it says that you will have the right clauses in your contracts all the way upstream. So that under these conditions, which have now been met, you will go and fetch for me, or ask to go and be fetched for me, this information this very moment and deliver it to me, in the next 30 seconds. Otherwise there's a fine of $30,000. And I could build that today. All that technology exists.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that exists now. I recently got a deal to subscribe to Ancestry.com for half price. So I renewed it. The stuff that I had been searching for in terms of family tree and history and so forth, as soon as you renew, it pops up all these suggestions. So it has gone and done word recognition in old documents and photo recognition and all sorts of things. And it's absolutely fascinating. As things get digitized, more and more connections get revealed, and you can start to reconstruct what took place before without you having to do all the research. And these are even international. We were in Dublin one time. I was at Trinity College trying to find my ancestors, and you have to know what parish they were in, what church parish, and I didn't know. This thing found them. I mean, it's kind of amazing.
It really is, and you're amazing. But we have used up all the available time that we can get in this forum, though. So, Dennis, thank you for this. Thanks for all you've done for all of us all these years. Thanks for being a good friend. Thanks for coming out to my ridiculous boats. You saw these things in a maturity level that is not commonly known. So thank you.
No, it's been a fun opportunity and a fun experience to know you and know the Twains, and thanks for this. And if I can think of the profound thing I was going to share before, I'll send it to you.
Well, we can come back and do it as a short.
Okay, it's a deal.
All right. Thank you again, Dennis. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Feel free. There's more on Text Run TV, and you follow the Inevitability Curve. Sponsors are welcome. Cheers. Bye.